The East China Sea keeps its own kind of silence, not the silence of empty water. There is no empty water in the East China Sea. It is one of the busiest maritime corridors on the planet, threaded by shipping lanes that connect the factories of eastern China to every port in the Pacific, crisscrossed by fishing fleets from Japan, South Korea, and China, competing for the same diminishing stocks in overlapping claim zones. On any given day, the radar picture in this body of water looks less like navigation and more like a city at rush hour. Hundreds of contacts, all moving, all with their own heading and speed and legal status, all sharing a space that was designed by geography to accommodate a fraction of the traffic it actually carries. In the middle of that traffic, 170 kilometers from the Chinese coast and 170 kilometers from the Okinawan island chain, sits a cluster of uninhabited rocks. The Senkaku Islands, called the Diaoyu Islands in China, the Diaoyu Tai Islands in Taiwan, are 5 main islands and 3 smaller rocks, with a combined land area of roughly 7 square kilometers. They have no permanent population. They have no infrastructure. They have no economic value independent of the maritime zones their possession establishes and the symbolic weight their sovereignty carries in the ongoing contest between 2 of the largest economies on Earth. Japan administers them. China claims them. The United States, under the Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan, is obligated to defend Japanese administrative control if it is challenged by force. That treaty clause, applied specifically to the Senkaku Islands in 2010, reaffirmed by every subsequent U.S. administration, is one of the most consequential sentences in the current strategic architecture of the Pacific. It means that a dispute over 7 square kilometers of uninhabited rock carries, embedded within it, the formal commitment of the United States military. China has known this since 2010. The knowledge has not reduced the frequency of its provocations in the area. It has changed their character. The U.S. destroyer had been operating in the East China Sea for 6 days, conducting joint operations with the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force as part of a bilateral exercise scheduled 18 months in advance. The exercise was routine. The area of operations was routine. The presence of U.S. and Japanese warships in the East China Sea was routine. The CCG vessel that appeared on the radar at 6:23 a.m. on the 4th day of the exercise was not routine. It had been there for 3 days. Not this specific contact, not the same hull number, not the same vessel, continuously. But a CCG cutter of the same class, maintaining a position within 6 nautical miles of the U.S.-Japanese formation's patrol area, had been present since the exercise began. The crews rotated. The vessel was always there. And each day, the distance between the CCG vessel and the U.S. destroyer's nearest approach point had been slightly smaller than the day before. Day 1, 11 nautical miles. Day 2, 8 nautical miles. Day 3, 6 nautical miles. Day 4 began at 6:23 a.m. with the CCG cutter at 4 nautical miles and accelerating. CPA to CCG cutter 4.0 nautical miles, closing at 9 knots. This was not the Hormuz swarming doctrine. This was not the South China Sea cabbage strategy with its layers of fishing vessels and Coast Guard cutters and distant naval backup. This was something more patient, more deliberate, and in many ways more difficult to respond to, the incremental approach. Each day, one step closer, each step small enough to be individually defensible as normal maritime activity. Collectively, over 4 days, adding up to a campaign of progressive encroachment designed to establish a new baseline for what Chinese presence in this area looked like. A baseline that, once established, would make the next increment easier to justify. Salami slicing applied not just geographically but temporally. The genius of the approach was its deniability at every individual step. No single day's position was provocative by itself. No single closure rate triggered any specific threshold in the rules of engagement. Only the pattern across 4 days revealed the intent, and patterns required time and documentation to establish in any forum where establishing them mattered. The JMSDF destroyer, operating 15 nautical miles to the north, had been tracking the same CCG vessel since day one. Its commanding officer and the U.S. captain had discussed the pattern during their daily communications window the previous evening, analyzing the rate of closure and estimating when the geometric progression would require a response rather than continued observation. The answer was today. The East China Sea had a specific quality of light at this hour. Flat, diffuse, the sun still low enough that its angle produced glare on the water rather than illumination. The destroyer's bridge windows faced northeast, directly into the glare, which meant the CCG cutter approaching from that bearing was harder to see visually than it was on radar. The bridge crew were working from the tactical display rather than the binoculars, which was the normal condition for professional naval operations in this era, but which had its own texture of tension. Knowing something was out there at 3.2 nautical miles and not being able to see it with your own eyes, only as a symbol on a screen, gave the situation a specific kind of abstraction that the radar number alone could not quite resolve. The watch officer updated the log at 6:33 a.m. Contact bearing 273, range 3.2 nautical miles, course 115, speed 9 knots. The entry was factual. It did not capture that the contact had been closing for 96 hours. It did not capture that the exercise had been designed to assert exactly the right that the contact's presence was designed to erode. It captured bearing, range, course, speed. That was what the log was for. The captain had been reading the pattern since day 2. On day 1, the CCG vessel's presence at 11 nautical miles was within the range that Chinese Coast Guard vessels routinely maintained near U.S.-Japanese exercises in the East China Sea. It was notable, but not unusual. On day 2, 8 miles, still within precedent, but the direction of change was clear. On day 3, 6 miles, now inside the distance that required a notation in the exercise report to Fleet Command. The notation had gone out at 1800 local time. Fleet had acknowledged it. Fleet had not directed any change in the exercise pattern. That acknowledgement and the absence of additional instruction was itself a directive. The exercise would continue. The pattern would be monitored. If the progression continued, the commanding officer was authorized to respond in accordance with standing rules of engagement. He had the authority. He had the picture. He had the plan, developed with the JMSDF the previous evening and reviewed once more at 5:30 a.m. before the watch rotation. Day 4's response would not be improvised. It had been decided before Day 4 began. At 6:31 a.m., the CCG cutter had closed to 3.2 nautical miles. Its AIS was active, broadcasting its identity without concealment, which was itself a statement. This was not a covert approach. It was an overt, documented, deliberate encroachment by a vessel whose government wanted the record to show that it was there, that it had been there, and that its presence had not been challenged. The absence of a challenge was the objective, not confrontation, not collision. The absence of any response at all. If the U.S. destroyer and the JMSDF vessel continued their exercise pattern without altering their behavior, the CCG presence became normalized. Normalized presence was the first step in establishing the operational precedent for control. Beijing had used this logic in the South China Sea for a decade. It had used it in the East China Sea for 5 years. Each time the question was the same. Would the other side respond to something so small, so individually innocuous, so professionally undramatic as a Coast Guard vessel reducing its distance by 3 nautical miles per day? Channel 16 remained quiet. The CCG cutter had never once hailed the U.S. ship across 4 days, never issued a sovereignty demand, never done anything classifiable as a provocation under any specific legal definition. It simply existed in the area, closer each day, saying nothing. That silence was the most sophisticated element of the operation. The Seahawk launched at 6:35 a.m., not as an escalation response. As a documentation asset, the helicopter climbed to 600 feet and established an orbit that kept the CCG cutter in continuous camera coverage, a systematic record of the vessel's position, course, speed, and behavior, time-stamped and archived. If the CCG cutter's government wanted to build a record of presence in this area, the U.S. Navy would build a more detailed record of what that presence actually looked like, down to the heading of the cutter's bow and the activity on its deck at every minute of its approach. CPA to CCG cutter, 2.8 nautical miles. The JMSDF destroyer to the north adjusted its course at 6:41 a.m., a turn of 15 degrees that brought it onto a southward heading, closing the distance between itself and the U.S. destroyer, while simultaneously placing it on a course that would bring it between the CCG cutter and the Senkaku Islands. The maneuver was coordinated. It had been discussed during the previous evening's communication window and planned for implementation when the CCG cutter crossed the 3.0 nautical mile threshold. 2 warships, 2 flags, 1 line drawn in ocean between a Coast Guard cutter and the rocks it had been approaching for 4 days. The CCG cutter's response to the JMSDF course change was immediate and revealing. Its own heading shifted, a 4-degree adjustment to the northwest, away from the direct line toward the Senkaku Islands. Not a large change, not a retreat, but a directional shift that took it off the most direct approach vector and placed it on a longer arc. The tactical officer noted the change and updated the CPA calculation. The adjustment had added approximately 7 minutes to the cutter's time to the Senkaku's at current speed. 7 minutes was not significant in isolation. In the context of a 4-day incremental approach campaign, a course change away from the objective was operationally meaningful. The cutter's captain had made a calculation. The JMSDF's repositioning had changed the geometry enough that continuing the approach at the same rate, on the same vector, now required accepting a closer encounter with two warships rather than one. CPA to CCG cutter, 2.4 nautical miles. The friction arrived at 6:48 a.m. and came from the sky. A Chinese Y-8 maritime patrol aircraft, a turboprop reconnaissance platform operated by the planned Naval Air Force, had been transiting the area at high altitude since 6 a.m. Chinese maritime patrol aircraft operated in the East China Sea, routinely maintaining surveillance of Japanese and U.S. naval activities with the same regularity that American and Japanese patrol aircraft maintained surveillance of Chinese activities. One of the choreographies of great power competition. Both sides watching each other watch each other. At 6:48 a.m., the Y-8 descended from 18,000 feet to 4,000 feet and began a surveillance orbit directly over the developing situation below. 4,000 feet was low. At that altitude, the Y-8's camera systems could collect imagery at a resolution that made hull numbers, deck equipment, and crew activities distinguishable. More importantly, 4,000 feet placed the aircraft below the cloud layer that had developed overnight. Visible from the bridge, a large turboprop circling overhead in a pattern that made its purpose unmistakable. The Y-8 was coordinating with the CCG cutter. The cutter was providing surface presence. The aircraft was providing aerial documentation. Together, they were constructing a comprehensive record of the area that would serve whatever diplomatic or media purpose Beijing determined it required. It was the most sophisticated element of the 4-day operation, not just the approach, but the documentation infrastructure built around it. The approach alone generated Chinese presence. The documentation of the approach, carefully curated and released through state media, generated Chinese narrative and presence working together. That was the full architecture of the operation. The Seahawk repositioned at 6:52 a.m. It climbed from 600 to 3,800 feet, just below the Y-8's orbit altitude, and established a counter-orbit that kept the Chinese aircraft in its camera envelope. Now both sides were filming each other at close range, 200 feet of vertical separation between them over the East China Sea at 7 a.m. The turboprop wash from the Y-8's 4 engines created turbulence the Seahawk crew could feel in their controls. Professional, deliberate, thoroughly documented from both directions simultaneously. CPA to CCG cutter, 1.9 nautical miles. Closing, but the rate had slowed. At 7:04 a.m., the U.S. destroyer altered course 11 degrees to place itself directly between the CCG cutter and the Senkaku Islands. Not aggressive, not a blocking maneuver in any legal sense. A present statement expressed in geography. The line from the CCG cutter to the Senkakus now passed through a U.S. Navy destroyer's operational position. The symbolism was precise. The Senkaku Islands were behind the destroyer. The CCG cutter was ahead of it. The Mutual Defense Treaty was embodied in that moment in 11 degrees of course adjustment and 9,200 tons of American steel holding position between a Chinese government vessel and the islands it claimed. The captain had been at the center bridge window since 6:45 a.m. He had not spoken in 19 minutes. The officer of the deck had tracked every course update every CPA revision, every emission report from the electronic warfare team without a question or a request for clarification. There were no clarifications needed. The picture was exact. The decision had been made before the CCG cutter crossed the 3.0 nautical mile threshold. Made the previous evening during the communication window with the JMSDF, reduced to a course adjustment number and a trigger distance, and executed at 7:04 a.m. with the mechanical precision of a plan that had been rehearsed until the variables were gone. 23 years of surface warfare did not produce dramatic moments. It produced the capacity to make a decision before the moment required it and execute it without hesitation when the moment arrived. The CCG cutter's response came at 7:09 a.m. Speed reduction from 6 knots to 4. Then 4 sustained, the vessel barely making steerage way, not stopping, not retreating, but no longer advancing, at any rate, representing meaningful closure. CPA to CCG cutter, 1.7 nautical miles, rate of closure approaching 0. The Seahawk descended to 2,500 feet at 7:11 a.m., returning to standard surveillance altitude. The Y-8 held its orbit for another 19 minutes, then climbed back to 18,000 feet and resumed its transit southwest. Its departure was as unannounced as its descent. It simply climbed, leveled, and flew away. The CCG cutter's 41 minutes at minimum steerage way were not passive. The electronic warfare team tracked its emissions throughout. At 7:18 a.m., a low-power data link signal activated from the cutter, a transmission that lasted 11 seconds and could not be decoded with the U.S. ship's current intelligence package, but whose frequency characteristics and timing were consistent with a reporting signal. The cutter informing its shore station of the current tactical situation. Someone on Fiery Cross Reef or in a command center on the Chinese coast was receiving updates on what was happening 1.6 nautical miles from a U.S. destroyer in the East China Sea. What those updates said and what decisions they informed in whatever command chain managed this operation could not be known. What could be observed was the result. The cutter held its position. It did not escalate. It did not attempt to push through the geometry the two warships had established between it and the islands. It held at 4 knots, transmitted its 11-second update at 7:18 a.m., and waited. The waiting was its own statement. A vessel that held position for 41 minutes without retreating was not conceding the objective. It was recalibrating. It was communicating to the record, the AIS record, the radar record, the state media record, that it had been present, that it had been in the area, that Chinese Coast Guard activity in the East China Sea near the Senkaku Islands was normal and ongoing, and not something that an American destroyer's course adjustment could permanently prevent. It would be back tomorrow, at a different distance, on a different approach vector, with a different set of variables. The incremental campaign would continue. Today's outcome was not a victory for either side in any permanent sense. It was a data point, one day's result in a campaign that was measured in months and years, not in the 41 minutes between 7:09 a.m. and 7:52 a.m. on this specific Tuesday. But data points accumulated. Patterns built from data points established precedents. Precedents created the baseline against which future conduct was measured. Today's baseline was 1.6 nautical miles. That was better than 1.2 nautical miles, which is where the geometric progression would have placed the Day 5 baseline if nothing had happened this morning. The salami had been cut in the wrong direction, not permanently, not decisively, but today. The CCG cutter held position at 4 knots for 41 minutes. CPA stabilized at 1.6 nautical miles. It did not close further. It did not retreat. It held, a vessel at minimum steerage way. Its incremental campaign paused at a distance it could not reduce without a direct response from the warship, positioned between it and its objective. At 7:52 a.m., the cutter increased to 6 knots and altered course northwest, not dramatically. A gradual turn, as if it had somewhere else to be. Its AIS continued broadcasting. The official record would show routine maritime operations. The Seahawk's archived footage, timestamped from 6:35 a.m. to 7:52 a.m., would show something else entirely. On the bridge, the watch rotation happened at 8 a.m. The outgoing brief was factual. CCG contact departed northwest, last bearing and range. Radar picture clean. Exercise resuming on schedule. The helmsman went below. 25 years old. He had held a course that placed a U.S. Navy destroyer between a Chinese government vessel and a chain of disputed islands for 41 minutes. The full weight of what that meant, the treaty obligations, the strategic stakes, the 4-day pattern that had been building toward this morning, was not something he carried consciously at the wheel. What he carried was the course. 11 degrees adjusted, held, steady, for 41 minutes, while the CCG cutter sat at 1.6 nautical miles and calculated whether today was the day to push further. It was not. He poured coffee in the mess and sat down. Outside, the East China Sea continued its morning routine. The shipping lanes were full. The radar contacts were numerous. Nothing about the water looked different than it had at 5:30 a.m. One thing was different. The CCG cutter's 4-day approach had stopped incrementing. Day 5 would begin with the baseline at 1.6 nautical miles rather than 1.2. The salami had been cut in the wrong direction. 1. CCG cutter. 4-day incremental approach campaign. Day 4 closure rate achieved. 0. Final CPA. 1.6 nautical miles. Course deviations yielded by the formation. 0. Presence answers presence. In the East China Sea, the ship that holds the line between the claimant and the claimed makes the law of the sea in the only language the law of the sea actually understands. Tonnage, position, and the willingness to remain.